developed our bodhicitta to that extent yet, so we do have to cultivate it continuously through the techniques that I briefly touched on last week as well. And to do the one technique in a very brief way, we can begin by, of course, recognizing that all sentient beings are equal to us in terms of the roles that they've played in our lives as friend, enemy, stranger. There's nothing said about that. Beings move from role to role, even within a lifetime, but certainly from lifetime to lifetime. So the attitudes that we have towards beings are not really valid. The attachment to friends, the aversion we have towards enemies, the indifference towards strangers. Again, without going into a deeper meditation, just try to cultivate this sense of an equal regard for all beings. And on the basis of that, think about the fact that the Buddha says every one of those beings has been your dear, kind mother, father, sister, brother, whoever it was that you look at in this life as a model of care, concern, love, compassion. Every one of these beings has been in that role because we've had countless lifetimes. Moreover, when they were in that role, they showed you unbelievable kindness. And generate in your own heart right now a wish to repay that kindness. And to think that we're going to do this in the best way possible, not simply repaying it in a very temporal way, but in the ultimate way, trying to help sentient beings once and for all to have what it is that they seek. And what is it that they seek? First, the wish to be happy pervades their minds. Happiness is what they're seeking. So generate this great love that is intent upon placing all these beings in happiness as a way of repaying their kindness. And moreover, they also are seeking to be free from suffering. So generate the great compassion that is intent upon protecting every one of these beings from suffering. And then through the power of those minds, we come to a strong determination, this altruistic resolve, this determination that we are going to do whatever it takes to actually accomplish that, even if we have to become the sole guide for all of these beings, if we have to take full responsibility for leading each and every one of them out of their suffering into perfect happiness, we will do that. And that leads to the question, but how will we do that? We have to acknowledge that where we're at right now, the extent to which we have or have not developed our own minds, our own abilities, leads us to the conclusion that we can't possibly benefit beings to that degree in our current state. Therefore, we must become a Buddha for the sake of these beings. Therefore, we have to know the Mahayana path. We have to understand the way of progressing towards enlightenment so that we can accomplish that goal and then be fully dedicated to helping all beings effortlessly, spontaneously. So again, through these thoughts, feel this motivation of bodhicitta in your heart, the desire to make our time together have the best possible result for all beings as well as for yourself. Through becoming a Buddha, to be able to then help each and every one of them perfectly. Okay, good. Again, welcome to the second class. The format for tonight will be pretty much similar to last week. I'll probably lecture for just about an hour, maybe a little less. We'll have a short break, and then I'll come back and continue the lecture and take some questions. And then we won't be doing discussion group. We've decided for this series. Again, the discussions certainly are always useful, but at the same time, this isn't really a formal part of the basic program. This is more information that can be useful for you in your own studies. And so we're going to let that go for this course, is my understanding. If anyone knows anything different, please let me know. But that was the understanding I had based on some of the conversations that we had after the last class. So let me go up and pull up the slides. I'm not going to, again, go into every everything I went into last week. The teaching should be out there in a video that you can go to and watch what I went through last week. But I essentially had three parts to what I was going to do, and I didn't get to the third part. It was in the tail end of the second part. An introduction to the course, and then an overview of the subject of grounds and paths, and then begin to kind of have an overview of the text as well as kind of get into the actual text. So I went through the context for this course, understanding that these are teachings to help us to attain the more ultimate goals of Buddhahood, which are liberation and enlightenment. And we're going to be focused on enlightenment because this is the Mahayana path, whereas the Hinayana path, the fundamental vehicle, is focused on liberation, self-liberation. And then we need to have a structure for studying that, for knowing that. And that's what Salam, as it's called in Tibetan, Sa being ground and Lam being path. Grounds and paths is the study of that. And there are many benefits to this type of study. Again, you can listen to it in last week's class and look at the slides. But essentially, we do gain a deeper appreciation for the path, more conviction in the path, and maybe get inspired to follow in the footsteps of these great beings who have traversed the path before us. So the next topic was, again, the overview of grounds and paths. I had a number of topics that I covered. I was on the last one, on the two obstructions. Let me take it off screen and actually do a review by using a little chart that was in some materials that were produced by Geshe Kelsang Wangmo. She's the first Geshe Ma, the first female Geshe to come out of the monastic system in the Gelugpa tradition. And she did a course on this, and you can actually find this entire handout out there. I could pass it on so that it could be put in the Dropbox, but it's a lot of pages, and I wasn't sure that everybody was going to want to necessarily have access to it. But she very kindly put together an entire sort of structure for this, and I'm using some of what she shared in her documents in this course. So if we look at on the left, again, is the Hinayana, or the fundamental vehicle. These are the beings who are intent upon self-liberation. To the right, the Mahayana, and that shouldn't say fundamental, by the way, that should say universal vehicle. I don't know why that that error made it in there, but essentially the Mahayana is the universal vehicle that embraces the welfare of all beings, as we just meditated. So in terms of the practitioner, these are the practitioners who only aspire to attain liberation in the fundamental vehicle, whereas practitioners who aspire to attain Buddhahood, which of course is encompassing the attainment of liberation, but it goes beyond that to attain this more profound state of spiritual development that we call Buddhahood. That's for the universal vehicle. The next line, the types of practice. Of course, the practices that one engages in the Hinayana are all about achieving self-liberation. So for all of us who've studied the Lam Rim, we know that that is the first two levels of the Lam Rim. To understand, the workings of karma and so on, as well as to get the bigger picture of how we are involved in cyclic existence and how we can become free of that by removing our fundamental ignorance, practicing the three higher trainings of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. All of this is what we hear in our teachings in the small scope and the middle scope of the Lam Rim. That's what Hinayana practitioners generally practice. In the Mahayana or universal vehicle, there are practices which pertain to them specifically, but they are all based on the core teachings in the Hinayana path. We just take that compassion we develop for ourselves in the Hinayana teachings and extend it to others. And of course, it includes the six perfections and so on, which are deeper practices within the Mahayana, taking again some of those same principles to larger or more pervasive degrees. The paths, there are 5 Hinayana paths, and within that we could say there are 2 sets of 5, the 5 hearer paths and the 5 solitary realizer paths. There are these 2 individuals who are both practitioners of the Hinayana. Again, I won't go into describing all of them. They're in the class notes as well, the slides. And then the 5 Mahayana paths, which is what we are studying in this course. There are 4 of them that are Bodhisattva paths, and then there is the one path that is in the continuum of a Buddha, the path of no more learning, the last path. So again, that's what the topic of this entire course is looking at the 5 Mahayana paths. And then, of course, the 10 grounds that are encompassed within the path of seeing and the path of meditation, the third and the fourth of the 5 paths. Then when it comes to the obstructions to be removed, this is what we're going to start off talking about in just a moment. The afflictive obstructions are what are called the obstructions to liberation. They are what keep you from being able to be liberated from samsara, to attain your own solitary nirvana. And of course, the bodhisattvas do remove those as well, but that is the main obstruction for those on the Hinayana, the fundamental vehicle. That's what keeps them from actually knowing that piece of nirvana. For the bodhisattvas in the Mahayana, the universal vehicle, there the afflictive obstructions and the cognitive obstructions are both obstructions to be removed. But the main one are the cognitive or knowledge obstructions, those obstructions to omniscience. But the bodhisattva has to remove the coarser ones, the afflictive obstructions, before they can remove the subtler ones, which are the knowledge obstructions. And I'm going to talk about what those are, as I said, in just a moment. The goal, of course, is liberation for those on the Hinayana, and the goal for those on the Mahayana is Buddhahood, which of course includes the attainment of liberation, because one goes beyond that liberation to attain an even greater state of perfection. So again, this is how we can see these two lining up. The only topic that isn't covered on this that I mentioned was how we enter into those. So again, the entrance, as I mentioned, for the Mahayana in my meditation tonight was bodhicitta, uncontrived bodhicitta. That's why we have to continually work on developing that using the techniques I went through last time. And then for the Hinayana, the realization that will lead you to enter into the Hinayana path is when you have the mind of renunciation that is set upon self-liberation. Bodhisattvas also develop renunciation as a prior realization before bodhicitta, but it isn't entryway to the Hinayana for them because they don't enter the Hinayana. They are not intent upon their own self-liberation. So for those who are on the Hinayana path, they enter it through uncontrived renunciation, a mind that is spontaneously arising in terms of turning away from samsara, turning towards the goal of nirvana, liberation. And then for the bodhisattvas, it's uncontrived bodhicitta, where they have that mind that is intent upon achieving enlightenment for the sake of all beings. All right, so let's go ahead and go back to the slides, and I will go through this last topic that was on the list that we didn't get to last time, talking a little bit more about the two obstructions, or sometimes they're called obscurations. It's the same meaning. They are what is blocking us from attaining these goals. So in our system, once more, recall that our system is the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school, said to be the highest thought of the Buddha. In our system, the afflictive obstructions refer to the root ignorance conceiving inherent existence. This, of course, is what we learned from the beginning, is that this is what's behind all of our being in samsara, as well as being in an unenlightened state, is the ignorance that's at the root of all of our problems. It gives rise to the delusions and gives rise to contaminated karma and causes us to never go outside the bounds of samsara, to never know any real peace. Of course, the other afflictions would be included in that because they arise from that ignorance: anger, attachment, jealousy, pride, what have you, all the various things that are included in the other afflictions. Then what are essentially the seeds of both of those, the seeds of the ignorance as well as the seeds of the other afflictions. What are the seeds? That's the second bullet point. The seeds of the afflictions hold the potential for afflictions to recur. These subtle propensities lie dormant until they meet with the conditions for them to arise. So we always have these sort of seeds of the afflictions in our minds. That's what we have to ideally get rid of so that they never arise again. Because if we always have the seeds there, even though we might suppress or in some way make the afflictions non-manifest, which you can do through certain levels of concentration, you still have the seeds for them. You still have the potential for them to arise when they meet with the proper conditions. So again, this is what we're trying to get rid of as what will keep us, these are what will keep us bound in samsara, keep us from attaining liberation. There are two categories of afflictive obstructions. The first are what are called the intellectually acquired afflictive obstructions, which are essentially those afflictions and their seeds that we've developed in our own mental continuum under the influence of various philosophical tenets, learning things about other systems that are contradictory to what we know of as truth in this tradition, that reinforce our reification of things, other religious teachings, scientific, even cultural beliefs and views. There's a lot of, this kind of reification of the view of a self that happens in a very subtle way within a single lifetime. We've all had some level of intellectually acquired afflictive obstructions that we've gained in this lifetime. They do not carry forward from life to life. They are intellectually acquired. The other category are what we call the innate afflictive obstructions, and innate being another word for inborn, that we do carry those from life to life. These are those afflictions and their seeds that arise naturally, and that they are inborn and thus are not conditioned by the culture and environment in which we live. Of course, this is also what we need to get rid of in a much deeper way to attain liberation. The acquired ones will be eliminated, as we'll see, on the path of seeing. It's the innate that we have to remove over the various levels through the seventh ground. When we enter the eighth ground, we will have removed all of those. Again, I'm kind of talking to some of these things that we will be going through as we go through this text. But the innate afflictive obstructions, of course, for those on the Hinayana path, the fundamental vehicle, they remove them. And as soon as they've removed them, they've completed their path. They enter into their path of no more learning, which is attaining the state of foe destroyer or arhat. But then, as I mentioned last week, they have to enter the Mahayana at some point in the future to remove the knowledge obstructions. But for the Bodhisattva, again, they will have removed both the intellectually acquired at the path of seeing, and then the innate through after one completes the seventh ground that is on the path of meditation. The bodhisattvas then go on what are called the pure grounds, the 8th, 9th, and 10th grounds. They're pure because they're free of those obstructions to liberation, the afflictive obstructions. But they have to remove these subtler obstructions. What are those? It says that this refers to the imprints of the root ignorance conceiving inherent existence and the dualistic appearance to which they give rise. These imprints are subtle latencies that are left on the mental continuum, and they cause this false appearance of inherent existence to the ordinary sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousnesses of sentient beings. We are always together with that. They say all sentient beings until you become a Buddha is together with that, other than when you're in direct meditative equipoise with a direct realization of emptiness, a non-conceptual realization of emptiness. So let me pull it off screen for just a moment to talk about these. So again, with everything that appears to us in our ordinary consciousnesses, such as this bowl that I use frequently as my little prop, it appears to have inherent existence. We have a conception that is assenting to that false appearance, but that false appearance is arising through the force of these imprints. And we assent to that, agree to that, believe in that. So we have two things going on. We have this false appearance that is coming from our ignorance grasping at that, and then the ignorance grasping at that itself. And we keep creating more and more imprints through this process so that we continue to be with this false appearance. And this is why it's so hard to break free of this ignorance, is because everything seems to have its own existence. The bowlness appears to be out here on this metal object in my hand, this basis. It seems to have its inherent existence. I'm agreeing to that through the force of my ignorance. That has to be removed first. That's what we are calling the afflictive obstructions, is that ignorance that is thinking that the way that things appear is in line with how they exist. They don't exist that way. And that's why we use all these reasonings that I went into, some of them with the Heart Sutra class, and then have previously taught on some of the other reasonings. The idea is we have to undermine that ignorance first, stop believing in the false appearance. Then the Bodhisattva eventually removes what's giving rise to this false appearance. The imprints, these subtle imprints that are due to having had this ignorance since beginningless time. We've created that latency, that keeps arising in the form of creating that dualistic appearance, that appearance of things existing on their own independently. So this is the problem for the Bodhisattva. This is what they ideally want to remove because it is what is keeping them from having perfect knowledge, from becoming omniscient. So as it says here, the knowledge obstructions prevent sentient beings from being able to realize the two truths, the ultimate truth of emptiness and the conventional truth of how things exist in a very subtle way. In the end, we come to understand that things only have existence through mere imputation, mere designation, this subtlest way that things are dependent arisings. Again, I'm not going to go into huge teachings on a lot of that. We'll see a little bit of that in the introduction from our author when we get to the text shortly. But again, this is the two truths refer to how we can take everything that exists and divide it either into an ultimate truth and emptiness, or the object that is possessing that emptiness, which would be the conventional truths. All the things that can be established through conventional awareness that again exist in a very, very subtle way. A Buddha has the realization of the two truths within a single awareness, whereas sentient beings are blocked from having that omniscience due to these obstructions, this dualistic appearance and the imprints that give rise to it. So as it says there, they thus obstruct sentient beings' mental consciousness from becoming omniscient. Of course, we would say a Buddhist sense consciousness is also a part of the omniscient mind, but it's the mental consciousness that we develop on the path, and that eventually becomes the omniscient mind of a Buddha. So since these are the subtlest obstructions, as I mentioned earlier, they are thus the last to be removed by the Bodhisattva. So let me take it off of here real quick and put back on that chart that shows the Mahayana Path. By the way, this was the one that we used last time, and that is out there, and most of you have seen this one before from various teachings I've done. This is the one we developed at the Master's Program, but there is another one that I'm going to put on, and after I go through this explanation, that you might find more useful. It's trimmed down a little bit, maybe in some ways, but it also maybe is even using some of the language that I might prefer. So anyway, know that again, when we talk about these obstructions, that essentially when we don't begin the process of removing them until we get to that path of seeing. Again, here, I think you can see where my cursor is. At the path of seeing is where we remove the the intellectually acquired afflictive obstructions. Then we go on to remove from this whole duration where it says B. So A is where you remove the intellectually acquired. B is where you remove the innate afflictive obstructions, which again is the ignorance, grasping at inherent existence, at true existence, and then the other afflictions that arise from that, and then the seeds of both of those. When we get to the pure grounds, C is where we remove all of the knowledge obstructions, obscurations. We're going to see again how we go through this process. That's part of the study of Salam, paths and grounds. So just know that this is what we're talking about. And then eventually when you remove the last bit of the knowledge obstructions, that's what keeps you from being a Buddha. You cross over into the fifth path, the path of no more learning. So most of the removal of all of this happens through the path of meditation. The path of meditation is where we remove all of the innate afflictive obstructions, as well as everything that is a knowledge obstruction. Okay, so again, this is the other one that I asked Mary to put out on the Dropbox, which she's done. So this comes from Nalanda Monastery. They took the chart that we had produced in the master's program. Again, I didn't produce it. I'm not that good with these sorts of programs. And they just made it into something that might work a little bit better. Like I said, it's tidied up a little bit, it seems, and might be a little bit easier for you to work with. But I will try to refer to this one going forward when we go through these sorts of explanations of where we're at on this chart. Okay, so you can find that again at the Dropbox that is out there at the page that you came through to link to tonight's teaching, I imagine. So again, this is the two levels of obstructions that we're talking about here. And for the Bodhisattva, they remove both of them, but they remove the knowledge obstructions after the afflictive obstructions, because they're not the main obstruction for a Bodhisattva. The main obstruction for a Bodhisattva is what keeps them from having the mind of a Buddha, the omniscient awareness of a Buddha. Okay, so now that we've gone through kind of all of the preliminary topics that we'll be touching on throughout this, at least I covered most of them, we're going to have an overview of the text, and then I will actually go through and review it part by part. Again, we're going to skip some parts, but I'm going to do most of the text, I hope. We'll see if I'm able to in the time I have. By the way, Geshe Kelsang Wangmo, she taught this, she taught the whole subject of grounds and paths in 43 sessions. So I don't think I'm going to do it justice, but nonetheless, you'll get some information by going through it in these series of classes that we have that are only, I think, a total of 7 classes. So um, okay, there's the author of our text, Jetsun Losang Dadren. He's Mongolian. These are his dates. He didn't live that long ago, really. He died after my mother was born. So we can actually talk about somebody who was in the 20th century. So a lot of these texts that are studied again are from older times than this particular text is. Recall again that this is a presentation of grounds and paths of Salam from the Prasangika Madhyamaka, which is very rare. This is cited as one of the few texts that teach Salam from that perspective. So the first part is the portion of the text we are studying, which presents the grounds and paths. And it was translated into English by a man named Jules Levinson. I don't really know much about him. He's done a little bit of writing and stuff. This was actually his topic for his dissertation, I think, was the Salam, grounds and paths. So there is a second part, which consists of debates that are used in learning this topic in monasteries, where you go through various pervasions and you kind of pick the definitions apart. That's something we won't be doing as part of this, obviously, and we don't even have the translation for that. So just know that, again, this is the text. The text is out on Dropbox as well. That's through the kindness of Jules Levinson, as well as it was made available through Sravasti Abbey's website, Tupten Chodron's teachings, because she has taught on this, and she had quite a few classes on it as well. So again, I don't think I'll be doing the full text justice, but the structure of the text is that there will first be, within the entirety of the text, an expression of worship, and then the author's introduction. Then there's the general presentation of grounds and paths. And of course, the other topic is that debating material and what have you, that would be the whole second part. But within the general presentation of grounds and paths, it itself is divided into 2 parts: the fundamental vehicle grounds and paths, and then the Mahayana grounds and paths. We are not going to study the fundamental vehicle because I wanted to give you the information around the Mahayana. It can be useful sometimes to go through it first, but with the limited time that we have, I'm going to focus on part 2, which will be pages 10 through 38. And then there's a concluding verse. I know that the additional pages that are in that text are some charts of sorts, lists of things, and I might be touching on those too as we go through it. So let's break away from this and go through the first 2 things, which are the expression of worship and the author's introduction. I'm not planning on spending tons of time on these, but nonetheless, they're something that is a part of the text and I think is worth talking about a little bit. So the expression of worship, most texts do have this as their beginning. They have some way of paying homage that kind of creates a positive potential in their minds to go through the text and to teach, according to what they've learned, to set out this subject of Salam in this case. But they begin by, of course, paying homage to all these amazing beings who have come before them. So the first verse, I bow down to the 3, the conqueror and the 2 conqueror's children. And they are set out in the next 3 lines. The first, of course, the conqueror, is the supreme Shakyamuni Buddha, the son of propounders, the sun meaning like the brightest light that you can imagine, who propounded the Dharma. And of course, we know who Shakyamuni Buddha is. I don't need to say much about that. The next 2 are called conqueror's children here, bodhisattvas, but they are not technically bodhisattvas according to the Mahayana understanding. They appeared as bodhisattvas in the retinue of the Buddha. There were 8 of these. Remember, we saw that in the Heart Sutra teachings. Avalokiteshvara was another one of them. But these 2, Maitreya and Manjushri, were the main lineage holders of the teachings on the vast, meaning the vast methods of practicing the path, which is what Maitreya was sort of the lineage holder of. And then Manjushri, who held the lineage of the profound, the profound, meaning the teachings on emptiness. So Maitreya is being paid homage here, the excellent regent Maitreya, the unconquered, venerable protector. Again, Maitreya is renowned for having set out all of the ways that one develops one's mind in terms of bodhicitta and all of the teachings that support the development along the path. And then the wisdom teachings were Manjushri's lineage from the Buddha. Manjushri gathering into one the wisdom of all the conquerors. So we have these two, the vast and the profound, that are embodied in these two Buddhas who appeared as bodhisattvas in the retinue of the Buddha, who became lineage holders for those teachings, which of course were united into the tradition that we are practicing. Then the next verse, I bow down respectfully to the great scholars of the country of superiors. Superiors is a translation for the word Arya. We mentioned that last week, I believe. Know that this is India that's being referred to here. There are footnotes on some of this that you can see on your own copy of it, which of course is the land where Buddhism arose and developed, and where many great scholars and yogis practiced and taught. This is where the Nalanda tradition came from, was the Nalanda Monastery in India, which is where the main tradition that His Holiness always emphasizes that we're following in Tibetan Buddhism. The Venerable Nagarjuna, the Supreme Superior, and to his spiritual offsprings, Aryadeva and glorious Buddha Palita, as well as Chandrakirti, who clarified the thought of the Superior Nagarjuna, and so forth. Nagarjuna was one of two charioteers, they're often called. They kind of set the track. Nagarjuna, in the case of what he set the track of, was the middle way, the Madhyamaka that we are studying. And that is the tradition that came to Tibet and was seen as the superior tradition, the greatest tradition. He himself, greatly realized being, who took the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras of the Buddha, the Prajnaparamita, and clearly defined the intent of the Buddha. But then Buddha Palita came along, as well as Aryadeva, who was a student of Nagarjuna's, and they set out texts that more clearly explained even what Nagarjuna had put forward. Then Chandrakirti has come to be known as the real kind of propounder of the Prasangika point of view, because it's his text, the supplement to the Middle Way, that is studied in the monasteries. It's one of the texts that I studied in the master's program. Amazing text, beautiful text. So Buddha Palita is known actually as the model Madhyamaka in terms of the Prasangika tradition, but nonetheless, Chandrakirti gets a lot of the credit because his text ends up being studied much more. But Manjushri appeared to Tsongkhapa and told him to study the teachings of Buddha Palita to clearly discern the meaning of emptiness. So this is mostly, again, within the track of Manjushri that Nagarjuna appeared, because these are all the wisdom teachings that were disseminated and brought into the Tibetan tradition by virtue of studying Chandrakirti mainly, though also the teachings of the other Madhyamika masters that are mentioned there. Just so you know, the other charioteer was a Sangha. A Sangha isn't mentioned here because this is mostly a text in the wisdom tradition. And a Sangha is mostly, he was a disciple of Maitreya Buddha. Maitreya was his guru, appeared to him and gave him great instructions on the method side of the path. And through that, various texts were composed, including Abhisamaya Lamkara, which is mostly on the method side, how one practices the path and so on from that point of view. So just know that, again, there is another charioteer. He's renowned for having set out the teachings of the Chittamatra, the mind-only school. Remember, we saw the 4 tenet systems briefly in a slide last week. That's not going to be a huge discussion through this as the various tenet systems, but just know that there was that additional charioteer, if you will, that set out the other Mahayana tradition, the mind-only, whereas, again, we follow the Madhyamaka that was set out by Nagarjuna, and of course refined by those disciples and followers that came after him. The third verse, I bow down from the heart to the collection of scholars of snowy Tibet. Sometimes maybe sages, again, might be a better translation for scholars, but these great sages of Tibet, and he mentions 3 of them. Well, actually, there's a few inferred in there as well. But Nima Drakpa, who became the eye of the world, this term Lotsawa is kind of the eye of the world. It refers to those who do the translations of so many of these texts from Sanskrit it into Tibetan, and the one he's renowned for having done is Chandrakirti's text, Supplement to the Middle Way. It's due to the kindness and the insight of Nima Drakpa that we actually have that text in the Tibetan for the Tibetan monastics to study and what have you, and to investigate, debate, what have you. Then in the third line, the father Losang Jampel Ningpo. This is another name for Tsongkhapa. Lama Tsongkhapa, of course, is the founder of the Geluk tradition. His spiritual offspring, not offspiring, offspring, are the two great scholars themselves, Gyaltsab and Kedrop. Gyaltsab, if you see the picture of the two disciples with Tsongkhapa that's often used when you do Lama Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga, Gyaltsab is the one with a bit milder, more compassionate face, and Kedrop has got a bit stern look to him. But these two are amazing scholars in and of themselves. And then, of course, the matchless king of scholars who came a bit later, Panchen Sonam Drakpa, who authored a lot of the textbook literature for the Losling College and for Ganden Shartse, those are some of the monastic traditions within the Gelugpa. So again, these are this Mongolian who is writing our texts is, paying heed to all of these beings in Tibet in particular, upon whom his own knowledge depends. Without all of them, he wouldn't know any of these things to set forth in this text. So then he says, having bowed my head to the feet of the skilled tutors, which could include, of course, other gurus that he's had that were more direct in his learning, because these beings he just mentioned in the third verse were centuries before. He lived again at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. So he had his own gurus, of course, that he's also paying homage to. But he says, who, clearing away with the eye medicine of stainless scripture and reasoning. This is the eye medicine of the Dharma. It's called eye medicine because it opens up our wisdom eye. It opens up our ability to know everything. And of course, the Dharma Jewel itself is divided into two. The Dharma of scripture, which are the written teachings that we need to investigate and study, all of what the Buddha wrote, as well as all the great treatises, what's called the Kangyur and the Tengyur, and then all of the Tibetan treatises and commentaries that were produced on the basis of that. And then the Dharma of reasoning, which is, of course, the deeper investigation that we do in our own minds that creates our own realizations. If we don't actually do our own reasoning and, investigate all of these teachings, we never gain any real change in our minds. Just knowing the scripture alone is not enough. So the real Dharma Jewel, if you will, is the Dharma of realization that comes about through reasoning. So clearing away with the eye medicine of stainless scripture and reasoning, the illness of the dim sight of ignorance from the eye of my mind. So he's bowing in homage to those beings who helped to clear away his own ignorance, to help him to see reality through the force of the eye medicine of the Dharma. And then he says, bestow the glory of seeing the good path of the profound meaning. He's making a request to them, having paid homage to them, give him the glory of seeing the good path of the profound meaning of emptiness, and so on. And then there's this idea of kind of churning milk to become butter, to like get the cream and the butter, the essence of it in the richest way, not just in terms of the richness of those substances in terms of dairy, but the richness of the Dharma. So through churning well with a paddle of analysis and effort, the ocean of milk, the word and scripture of definitive meaning being again those teachings that provide the correct way of viewing emptiness, meaning the emptiness of inherent existence. Everything else is interpretative at some level because it's only the definitive meaning teachings that we end up relying upon in the end to the greatest degree. All of the interpretable teachings need to be seen in that light. So this ocean of milk, the word and scripture of definitive meaning, we're going to churn it and make this good explanation, the essence of butter, arise from it. So listen, I give this to those interested persons of clear intelligence. So, he's certainly putting forward that, he has some ability to talk about this subject through the kindness of his teachers, his gurus, that have helped him to do this process of, extracting the essence of it, the essence of butter from this ocean of milk of the Dharma that he's going to be presenting to us in this text. And that's probably good enough on that. We'll go to the very next page. This is called the author's introduction. Sometimes texts don't really have this. It's kind of interesting, but maybe it's because it's a little bit later that this text has this. And I'm going to go through it again and touch on what I can, but I don't want to make it like, this a whole teaching in and of itself, but there's a lot of really good stuff in here. So he says, all the modes of asserting the three, these are often talked about as kind of the three elements: the basis, the path, and the fruit. Kind of the basis is the beginning point. What do we start with in terms of what is the basis upon which all of the Buddha's teachings are built? The basis is taught as being the two truths that I mentioned earlier. Everything that exists, conventionalities, conventional truth, as well as ultimate truth, emptiness. On that basis, one then practices a path. What does the path consist of? Well, we often talk about the path once more of having the two sides: the path of method, that again the lineage of Maitreya was involved in, and the path of wisdom, which was the lineage of Manjushri. The lineage of method works with conventionalities. That's its basis. The wisdom aspect works with the ultimate truth. That's its basis. So we have the method tied into conventional truths, the wisdom tied into ultimate truth. Well, what is the fruit? I mean, you might think the fruit is only the fruit of Buddhahood, but we divide Buddhahood up into two main elements as well. The method side of Buddhahood, in terms of its culmination by having practiced the method side of the path, is the ability to then manifest for others what we call the Rupakaya, the form bodies of a Buddha. Again, we're going to see the Rupakaya at the tail end of this text when we look at the path of no more learning, the resultant state of Buddhahood. So that's one aspect of a Buddha's experience. Through the force of having been rooted in conventionalities, having practiced the method side of the path, they then have the ability to enact the welfare of others in a physical form, appear to sentient beings in a way that will be useful for them to learn the Dharma and so on. In terms of the other aspect of a Buddha's experience, there's what's called the Dharmakaya, the wisdom truth body of a Buddha. That truth body of a Buddha is the fully developed awareness of a Buddha in terms of their omniscient mind, which arises from their wisdom consciousness, which is, of course, the path part of it had to do with wisdom, grounded in the basis, which is ultimate truth. So when we talk about basis, path, and fruit, it's a way of saying, what is the foundation upon which it's all built? What is the path that draws upon those? And then what is the fruit, the result that one achieves from that? So in this way, we can see that there are these dual tracks that have to do with, again, the method and wisdom side of the path being rooted in conventional and ultimate truth, respectively, and then giving forth to the Rupakaya, the form bodies, and the Dharmakaya, the truth body of a Buddha. So all the modes of asserting these three and the schools of tenets which hold the system of the compassionate one, our teacher, the Buddha, who confounded the heads of the foxes, those who were not as intelligent as or powerful as the lion, like Buddha, that bad proponents of tenets by proclaiming the great lion's roar of the tidings of dependent arising, are indeed the stainless thought of the word of the supramundane victor. So all of what was asserted in the various schools of tenets that were proclaimed by the Buddha through his lion's roar are the stainless thought of the word of the supramundane victor. Of course, this is essentially saying, and I'm sure Venerable George is touching on this in the tenets class, that everything that's encompassed in these various tenet systems is all skillful means of the Buddha to lead sentient beings all the way to the goal of attaining perfect enlightenment. Whether we talk about the basis, path, and fruit, the way I presented it, or however any tenet system might present it, these are all, the Buddha's way of working with what we have through different understandings and different tenet systems to get to the results that the Buddha taught. Which, as we talked about last week, the two more definite results we want to attain are liberation and enlightenment. So he says, however, the final thought of the supramundane victor himself is that although there does not exist even a particle, an atom of a phenomenon which is inherently established, it is established by reliable cognition that the presentation of the three, basis, path, and fruit, is surpassingly correct. So he's kind of once more asserting this reality that you can still posit the two truths as being completely intact through this final teaching of the Buddha. As we saw when we went through the teachings on the Heart Sutra, one of the big dangers that we have when we begin to explore the topic of emptiness, it's being set out in that little passage. Things lacking inherent existence, nothing whatsoever having an atom, a particle of inherent existence. That has a tendency in some people's minds to fall into the extreme of nihilism, where we negate things existing. We somehow think that in the space of emptiness, you've negated conventional reality, that things don't exist at all. No, you've negated the false way that you think conventional reality exists, but you haven't negated conventional reality. It exists as a dependent arising. Again, it exists through the force of causes and conditions, through the force of parts, and in the end, through the force of mere designation, mere labeling. So essentially, again, we're getting a little mini teaching on emptiness right at the beginning of this text. Our author kind of going into how the final thought of the Buddha is that these two truths can be upheld as completely complementary and in no way contradictory. So he says, and again, I'm not going to comment in greater detail on that. I apologize for those of you who might be new to this topic, but know that the teachings on the Heart Sutra, I went into a lot of these things in much more detail. This abides well in accordance with the commentary by the great skilled Madhyamikas, for whom dependent arising and empty, or emptiness, have come to be of the same meaning. Dependent arising, again, mostly referring to the conventional truth, how things arise in dependence upon, once more, causes and conditions, parts, and in the end, the third and subtlest way that they arise in dependence upon mere imputation, mere designation, conceptual designation. Those ways of arising that are conventionally existent and emptiness, which is the ultimate nature of things, are of the same meaning. They support each other. For, as it says there, wishing that in the end all trainees be led to the suchness of the three doors of liberation. Remember those from the Heart Sutra: the door of liberation, emptiness; door of liberation, signlessness; and door of liberation, wishlessness. Emptiness being the general characteristic of all phenomena, signlessness being the lack of an inherently existent sign in the causes, and wishlessness being the lack of an inherently existent sign in the results. So the suchness of these three doors of liberation, that final mode of existence that is emptiness, in accordance with the assertions of the Prasangikas. So this is what the Buddha is intending for, wishing that, he wants all trainees to get to this final thought. The teacher Buddha spoke well the four modes of tenet systems for the sake of leading those disciples temporarily to more profound levels of realization. And from this point of view, the erroneous modes of the assertions of the lower tenet systems are overcome by the reasonings of the higher systems. And one is set in the non-erroneous, the faultless assertions of the higher systems. And understanding the views of the lower schools of tenets is an excellent method of understanding the views of the higher systems. This almost sounds like, again, it could be an introduction to Venerable George's class, but it's essentially saying that everything the Buddha taught, once more, was skillful means. He taught these lower tenet systems as a bridge to get us to investigating things deeper and deeper. And we eventually get to the most profound view. And it is kind of a shame in many of our teachings, we go right to the profound view without going through those tenet systems. That's why Venerable George's course is a wonderful one to partake of if you haven't studied tenets before, because it gives you an appreciation for the way that the Buddha didn't package them that way. They were packaged that way after the time of the Buddha, looking back on what the Buddha taught. But it gave some structure to how the Buddha was teaching different people, different disciples in different ways at different times in accord with what they needed, what their predispositions were. A lot of people from other spiritual traditions might think, well, that's a crazy teacher, why don't they just say the truth in the one way that it exists and, that's it? Well, because the Buddha knew that not everybody was ready for that profound view. Not everybody can jump into the deep end of the pool, right? You have to learn how to swim in the baby pool and then get into the shallower area and then get into a little bit deeper area and what have you. So everything proceeds in that way because of the Buddha's intention, because of his skill and means and his compassion in wanting to lead beings to that highest view. Okay, that's what was being set out in that passage. Again, there's much more that could be said, I'm sure, but I'm going to skip over that. And again, you'll get lots from Venerable George if you're coming to his class on Friday. Then there's I'm not going to go into this so much. You can read the little footnote on this. I'm just going to summarize, but there is a quote from the Fundamental Treatise on the Middle Way, which is Nagarjuna's main text, in which he explains this final view of the middle way, that is the emptiness that we practice in this tradition. That is, as we saw, the final intent of the Buddha. In that verse, he says, all phenomena are real, unreal, real and unreal, and not real or unreal. So there's four things being asserted. The Buddha first saying things are real, then saying, oh, no, things aren't real at all. Then, oh, well, they're real and unreal, but then they're not real or unreal. This is what the Buddha taught. This is kind of a skillful way of leading people by beginning to, move them in the direction of arriving at the final thought, which once more is embedded in this idea of inherent existence. There is no inherent existent reality, nor is there any inherent existent non-reality. So again, then there's a little verse from Arya Deva that goes into that same idea. Buddha taught first that all phenomena are truly existent, all phenomena are real, and that all phenomena are not truly existent. To be the second one. Then that some phenomena are truly existent and some are not truly existent. That's the real and unreal. That's in the second line of Nagarjuna. And then finally, and that both the truly existent and the non-truly existent are not truly existent, that there is no reality at that level. Again, when we define what we mean by this, again, this would be like a whole nother class to go into all the commentary on that, but essentially what he's saying in the last line, by way of the power of various illnesses, various predispositions, are all four of these taught. That's the line on the next page. Oops, went too far. Not to be called medicine, that they are taught, and they should all be called medicine. They are medicine for different, levels of being. So let's go back to that previous one and recite that line again. So it says, by way of the power of various illnesses, are all four of these not to be called medicine? Yes, all four of them are to be called medicine because they lead beings along that path to eventually attaining the realization of the most profound view. So they are all taught as completely valid teachings. Then we have another little summary kind of thing in this verse that is essentially speaking to some of what I touched on previously, as is said in Ashvaghosha's essay on the stages of cultivating the ultimate mind of enlightenment, we call ultimate bodhicitta, emptiness. However, the compassionate one, the Buddha, abiding in the mode of the two truths, and thoroughly depending upon conventionalities, proclaimed selfless in the great voice of a lion. Again, the lion's roar. So upholding within the two truths, conventional truths, the way that things exist in a conventional manner, he proclaimed the ultimate truth of selflessness with some dependence upon those, because again, they are interdependent. You can't have a conventional truth without its ultimate truth. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Remember this from the Heart Sutra teachings. So then through synonyms such as emptiness, suchness, final reality, and so forth, limitless examples such as likeness with a magician's illusions, dreams, mirages, and so forth, and the skillful means of a variety of vehicles, Buddha made known the meaning of the middle way, the Madhyamaka, not abiding in any gross or subtle extremes. Again, that's what we want to find, is that middle way that doesn't cause us to fall into the extreme of nihilism I was mentioning earlier, nor the extreme of eternalism that we are in now, grasping at things to exist inherently. So I'm not going to talk so much about some of these, because even in Sunday's class, I talked about illusions and dreams, mirages, these ways that are similes for us to understand how things can appear in one way but exist in a very different way. And so through these teachings on emptiness, through the examples and all the skillful means he taught, all the various reasonings and so on, he made known this meaning of the middle way. So again, he's introducing this by virtue of explaining a little bit about emptiness, but that's because the path that we're looking at and the grounds are mostly geared around the development of one's wisdom of emptiness. As you'll see when we get into these, there is a merit component. The method side of it is involved, but it's mostly demarcated by how the Bodhisattva goes through deepening their insight into emptiness. Okay, so now we get the little paragraph that precedes our actual text in terms of the content. It says, within the Mahayana, there are two vehicles: the causal perfection vehicle, what we often call the sutra, and the effect Vajra vehicle, what we call the tantric teachings, or Vajrayana. Remember, I mentioned last week that this text is only going to explain it according to sutra, but there is also a parallel track in Tantra where these same paths are attained and the grounds are attained and so on. So he says, I will express briefly a presentation of the grounds and paths of the three vehicles. Again, the two Hinayana that we won't be going through, those are the hearers and solitary realizers, and then the third, the Bodhisattva path, the Mahayana. In, of the first of those, the perfection vehicle, in accordance with the uncommon mode of assertion of the glorious prasangikas, the great thoroughly non-abiding madhyamikas, the very peak of all proponents of tenets of the great and small vehicles. So he's saying, I'm going to teach it according to sutra, and not just sutra, but according to the highest point of view, the prasangika madhyamika. With respect to that, his explanation, there are two parts. As I mentioned, the one that we have the copy of are explaining the presentation of the grounds and paths generally, and then briefly investigating the limits of pervasion beginning from the mode of assertion of objects of abandonment and antidotes. That's the longer part of it, or the other part of it that isn't translated, that we don't have, that is for studying these limits of pervasion, kind of really getting delineation about what the boundaries are, where things are defined, how we have to have that deeper level of understanding, and that's what they develop in the monasteries through debating this material. So the general presentation of grounds and paths that we have the copy of has two parts. It has the presentation of the grounds and paths of the fundamental vehicle and the presentation of the grounds and paths of the Mahayana. So as I mentioned, in the next page and through the next couple pages, there's the fundamental vehicle. I'm going to skip over it right now, and then we're going to take our break. But essentially, I do want to go through this little thing on etymologies. Well, maybe I don't need to. I think it'll be fine because we will look at those in terms of the Mahayana in a moment. So you're basically going forward to what, page 10 of your commentary, and we'll start there when we come back after our break. So I have about 8:09. So let's say at 8:20, just a little bit over 10 minutes then, and I'll ring the bell to resume things then. All right, have a good. Okay, I just might mention that there was a message to everyone, someone having, Venerable Pemo, having problems with opening PDF files. If any of you can help, I mentioned it to Shanka in particular because I thought he might have some information, but there was an issue with the Adobe Acrobat Reader that was downloaded and not being able to open our documents. I'm not that tech savvy to know what to say to that. So, all right, let me go ahead and continue with things, but I think it might be good at this point, since we are going to get into the text then and actually start talking about paths and grounds, just to see if there are any questions on anything up to this point, either from last week, the material I looked at, or from tonight. Anything anyone wanted to ask about that wasn't clear? Not sure I'm always clear in everything I'm sharing, so no? No questions. Okay. All right. Well, then let's get into the text and see what we'll see. So again, we went forward. Let me pull up the slides just so we get grounded in kind of the overall outline then again. So we finished these first two, the expression of worship and the author's introduction. Now we're in the main, this is the rest of the text that we have other than the concluding verse. But essentially, yeah, this general presentation of grounds and paths. And as I mentioned, it's divided into the fundamental vehicle and then the Mahayana grounds and paths, which is what we are going to be studying. So part 2, the Mahayana grounds and paths, is divided in turn into 3 parts: the definitions of these, and then the divisions. We'll see it being divided into the causal grounds and the result grounds, and then the etymologies that will be kind of explained at the tail end. So the very first one is the definitions of ground and path. So let's go ahead and go through the text, and then I do have some additional things to share in slides that you might find interesting. I found them interesting when I located them. Came across a document that I think Bob had actually given to me some time ago. That's a chapter from a book called Paths to Liberation, and the chapter's by Jeffrey Hopkins. But anyway, I'll share a few things from there on paths and grounds. So again, this is just explaining at the beginning that there's three parts to this. The very first part, definitions. Definitions starts off with the definition of a Mahayana ground. A Mahayana ground is a clear realizer, of course, meaning that this is a consciousness that we're talking about here, of one who has entered a Mahayana path, meaning somebody who is a bodhisattva, who has developed uncontrived bodhicitta and is therefore on the Mahayana path, which serves as a basis of the many good qualities which are its effect. And this is actually where we come up with this kind of etymology of the word ground. It's like the ground or the foundation, the basis for the good qualities to arise, which are the effect of those clear realizations. The definition of a Mahayana path is a Mahayana clear realizer. So it's essentially the first part of it. A clear realizer of one who has entered a Mahayana path was what was said on for Mahayana ground. Mahayana path is a Mahayana clear realizer. It doesn't go on to describe the rest of that. But the two, Mahayana ground and Mahayana path, are also synonymous. They're referring to the consciousness of a bodhisattva that eventually, of course, gets developed into the resultant state of Buddhahood on the fifth path, the path of no more learning. That is a Mahayana clear realization. So again, these are said to be synonymous. Nonetheless, we are going to use the term ground, as I mentioned last week, to refer to 10 specific parts of the path. That is where the Bodhisattva does do a lot of this development of the deeper qualities that eventually culminate in enlightenment. But everything that the Bodhisattva does throughout their path, from when they enter till when they finally achieve Buddhahood, is in the same line with that. It's just we delineate 10 different parts as 10 grounds, and we delineate 5 different parts as 5 paths, but they're all referring to essentially the same thing, a clear realization within the mind of a bodhisattva, someone who is on the Mahayana path. So I think it might be insightful to take a look at some of this that's shared, and I put it in the slides here. As I mentioned, this comes from, first, just a very brief introduction to each of these from His Holiness's book that he did with Venerable Thupten Chodron, called Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions. A consciousness that is a spiritual realization, a clear realization, is called a path. Again, in Tibetan, this is Lam. In the Pali, it is Magga. In the Sanskrit, it is Marga, because it leads us out of samsara and to awakening. So His Holiness gives a little more connotation to it. It is a path that leads us out of samsara and to awakening. It's actually a consciousness that is involved with those two goals, again, of getting out of samsara, liberation, and to full awakening, Buddhahood. To go into a little bit more detail, though, again, Jeffrey Hopkins in this article that's from this book that I appreciate Bob having given me this some years. I think it was you, Bob, that gave it to me. The article that specifically is called A Tibetan Perspective on the Nature of Spiritual Experience. And in that, he quotes a book. I've given the English version of it rather than the Tibetan, Gonchok Jigme Wangpo's presentation of the grounds and paths. The term marga, which again is path or lam in Tibetan, is said to refer to something that opens the way to higher states. So in that text, he defines it as this: the definition of a path is an exalted consciousness of one who has entered the path, which serves to open a passageway, allowing an opportunity to progress to the enlightenment that is its result. Remember, in the Hinayana, they could call those the lower enlightenment, the enlightenment of a hearer, the enlightenment of a solitary realizer. We usually just call it self-liberation. And we reserve the term enlightenment for the Bodhisattva path. The culmination of that is enlightenment, meaning complete enlightenment in Buddhahood. But nonetheless, this is kind of saying it's got that additional kind of quality to it of opening a passageway. Kind of like, again, if you, this word path is very evocative. If you went to the woods and there was no sort of open passageway that allowed you to progress to the mountaintop, well, then you'd have to forge your own way through, right? You'd have to be out there with a machete cutting through brush and what have you to get there. So this idea of opening a passageway or removing any obstacles to, progress is the idea behind a path. Denma Lodro Rinpoche, he says, brings the stilted lane. And this is from a teaching that Jeffrey Hopkins, I guess, translated from Denma Lodro Rinpoche, where that teacher said, for instance, opening a door reveals a passageway, allows a passageway. Or in another way, another example, if you're driving a car and there's a large boulder in the road, you would have to break it up into pieces to get it aside, thus opening up a passageway. Paths allow passage by removing obstacles. What did we just talk about? The first topic tonight, after we did a brief review, was the obstacles, the obscurations. Paths allow passage by removing obstacles. They show where the obstacles are and what we need to do to remove them. They also are tracks set down by earlier practitioners. Denma Lodro Rinpoche again renders this point in everyday terms. What is a path? In the world, we call the tracks, Tibetan would be shul, of someone who went before and which serve as a way to be followed by those who go afterwards, a path. Again, like I said, there's a lot of kind of shades of meaning to using this word path. That which allows us to go forward in the footsteps of these beings is the idea here. That which allows us to remove these obstacles, or what have you. And he goes on to say, we know many kinds of paths, a road such as is used by cars, the tracks used by a train, a footpath one might follow when walking in the mountains. The term path is used here in a similar manner. We call paths those ways of proceeding of the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and the superiors, the Aryas of the past. The kinds of thoughts they generated. Again, we're talking about consciousnesses. We're talking about not a physical path like those other descriptions, but the consciousnesses that they generated, which is how those who wish to generate such realizations in the present and the future must proceed. Now, to go on to talk about ground, the word ground, again, from His Holiness's book that he did with Venerable Thupten Chodron, a consciousness that is a spiritual realization is called a ground. Sa is the Tibetan again, or bhumi in the Sanskrit. I guess it's the same in the Pali. He didn't put the Pali version of that in there. Because it is the foundation, the basis again, for the growth of good qualities and release from obscurations. Being able to be free of the things that block us, that get in the way of our movement forward. Okay, so paths are also called grounds or earths, in the sense that they serve as the basis, ji, of high qualities of mind, just as the earth serves as the basis of innumerable activities. So again, from Denma Lodro Rinpoche, he says, a ground acts as a basis of the many qualities that are its fruit. Just as we saw just a short while ago when we looked at the basis, the path, and the fruit. The fruit that arises from it requires a ground, a basis, a foundation upon which it will grow and develop. Just as the ground or the earth acts as a basis of orchards, forests, and so forth, so these consciousnesses act as the basis of many qualities of those who have entered the path. Therefore, they are called grounds. A ground serves as a basis not only for producing that which has been produced, but also for maintaining what has been produced, as well as causing non-degeneration of what has been produced. So it's maintained as well as not allowed to degenerate. So this is, again, just giving more flavor to these terms that we're throwing around here, just calling this a path and this a ground and what have you. And one more thing on this. He says the term ground, this is Jeffrey Hopkins now talking, or the French terre, used by David Sefer Tarug, which seems so awkward and forced in a discussion of spiritual paths in English, is surprisingly explained by Denma Lodro Rinpoche as employed because of its familiarity and ease of understanding. So this is actually, again, a very skillful means for the Buddha to use this word ground, because we all understand what we mean by ground, what we stand on, what we sit on, and so on. So he says the reason why the paths of the three vehicles are called grounds is that they serve as the basis of one's generating higher qualities in one's own mental continuum. If in designation of a name one employs a term from common usage, then it is easily remembered and used. The term ground is known well, for if we are going, wandering, lying down, sitting, our activities are all involved with the ground or the earth. It's the support of all of our activities. Thus, through skill and means, using a term that is easy to understand, the term ground is used. The reason for designating the paths of the three vehicles as grounds is from the viewpoint of similarity of function. Just as the paths and grounds, serve the function of supporting our spiritual development, so, ground itself, and a path, even if we talk about a physical path on the ground, those support our, doing what we need to do in the conventional world, what have you, getting from point A to point B, all these various things. So it's a very kind of poignant way of describing these two terms, especially ground. So, all right, that's enough on that. Now we go back to the text and we look at the two divisions. We're going to see that, again, these are divided into what are called the causal grounds, which are the first two of the five paths. And then we have the Mahayana, I'm sorry, the first four of the five paths. And then we have the Mahayana result grounds, which is the fifth. So the first four, again, are the path of accumulation, the path of preparation, the path of seeing, and the path of meditation. These are all the causal grounds. They create the causes for the final fruit, the resultant state, which is the path of no more learning. So those are the two divisions, and we're going to see Mahayana causal grounds in turn divided into two: the grounds of Bodhisattva common beings and the grounds of Bodhisattva superiors. Common beings would be on the first two levels, in the path of accumulation and path of preparation, where the Bodhisattva, who of course has not yet realized emptiness directly, they are still ordinary in that regard. They're quite extraordinary as a Bodhisattva, but they're ordinary in terms of their realization. The grounds of Bodhisattva superiors are the third and the fourth, the path of seeing and the path of meditation, because they have that superior wisdom. They are Aryas. They have realized emptiness directly. Okay, so that's where we're going to go in terms of the outlines. Grounds of Bodhisattva common beings is in turn divided into the two that I mentioned, where you have an ordinary being on the path of accumulation, that is a Bodhisattva, and then the ordinary being on the path of preparation, who is also, again, a Bodhisattva. So that's where we're at in terms of the text. Let's go back to that and see what the text says. So again, divisions, maybe I don't need to go through that whole paragraph because that's essentially, well, actually I should, because it does give some of these synonyms. It says, so when Mahayana grounds are divided, there are two: the Mahayana causal and the Mahayana effect grounds. Mahayana causal grounds, Mahayana learner's ground, and Bodhisattva grounds are synonymous. Recall that once you reach the fifth path, or the fifth, the resultant ground, you're a Buddha. You're no longer a Bodhisattva. So Mahayana causal grounds, again, refers to the first four paths. Mahayana learner's ground also refers to those, because that's where you are a learner. You haven't yet entered the fifth path, the path of no more learning, where you're no longer a learner. And then again, Bodhisattva grounds, because you're a Bodhisattva through the entirety of entering the path of accumulation till exiting the path of meditation. And at the fifth path, you become a Buddha. You're no longer a Bodhisattva. So that clearly delineates what we're talking about, from the entrance to the path of accumulation through the exiting from the path of meditation, the fourth path. Mahayana effect ground, Mahayana non-learner's ground, and Buddha ground are synonymous for the same reasons that I just mentioned, because the effect ground is the fifth path, the path of no more learning. That, therefore, is a Mahayana non-learner's ground. There's no more learning to be done. You've culminated your wisdom in the omniscient mind of a Buddha, and therefore you're also on the Buddha ground. So when Mahayana causal grounds are divided, they are the two: grounds of Bodhisattva common beings and grounds of Bodhisattva superiors. So if we look at this little chart real quickly again, we see that it's marked at the top here with ordinary Bodhisattva and Arya Bodhisattva or superior Bodhisattva, and then finally Buddha. So these four, from entering the path of accumulation to exiting the path of meditation, at the very far right before you get to Buddha, those are the four causal grounds. And those are, again, are the Bodhisattva grounds or Bodhisattva paths, whatever you want to call them. And they are also, again, the what was the third thing that was mentioned in our text? The learner's ground, because you are a learner until you get to the path of no more learning. Once you cross over here and enter the path of no more learning, you're no longer a learner. You are on the Buddha ground. And of course, you're on the effect ground then. So that is the only path that was in the Mahayana effect ground. Then when we talk about the causal grounds, which are these first four paths, path of accumulation through path of meditation, the first two are said to be those of a common being, an ordinary bodhisattva, whereas the other two, path of seeing and path of meditation, are of an Arya bodhisattva, a superior bodhisattva. Okay, so that's where we're at in terms of the chart and what we are looking at. So the definition of a ground of a bodhisattva common being is a bodhisattva's clear realizer, which is included within the grounds of activities of belief. It's called activities of belief, at least in my assessment. I haven't seen a commentary that describes it, but it's because the bodhisattva hasn't yet realized emptiness directly. It's not that they just have a belief in emptiness, but it's saying it's not yet having that direct perception, what we call a yogic direct perception of emptiness. Remember that this is a presentation for those who are destined for the Mahayana from the beginning. So they aren't the people who've gone through the Hinayana path and realized emptiness and then have come around to enter the Mahayana. So they haven't yet had the realization of emptiness. So those, this is in reference to them that this would be called the grounds of activities of belief, because they have not yet developed that clear realization of emptiness that is accomplished on the path of seeing. That's what makes them a common being, an ordinary being as opposed to a superior. Then in the middle it says ground of a Mahayana common being and path of a Mahayana common being are synonymous. Once more, because ground and path in this presentation are synonymous. When grounds of Bodhisattva common beings are further divided, as we saw in the slides I just showed, there are the two: the Mahayana paths of accumulation and the Mahayana paths of preparation. So that's where we are now. We're going into the first of the five paths, the Mahayana path of accumulation. It has a definition that's set out. It is called a Mahayana clear realizer of the doctrine. And I have a slide prepared that will show you a little bit about what that means. Why is it called a clear realizer of the doctrine? Well, this is in contrast to what we see the path of preparation is going to be defined as, which is a Mahayana clear realizer of the meaning. So we'll get to that in a moment and I'll explain it further. But know that when the Mahayana paths are in turn divided, there are three: the small, middling, and great Mahayana paths of accumulation. So once more, we go back to the chart. We see that over here on the path of accumulation on the far right, again, what causes you to enter into that? You had effortless bodhicitta that causes you to cross that threshold. Having cultivated previous to the path, you now have it at a spontaneous level. You enter into the small level of the path of accumulation. It's subsequent to that is the medium, and then following that is the great. And these three levels are delineated in very specific ways, as I'll go into in a moment. In the meantime, let's go to talking a little bit more about this name for the definition for the path of accumulation, a clear realizer of the doctrine. So first, let's talk about the etymology of the term for it. In Tibetan, it's soklam. Sok means accumulate or accumulation. Lam means path. Now, Lama Zopa has been very keen on calling this the path of merit, because he talks about merit of virtue, which is the method side, and merit of wisdom, which is the wisdom side. And he is talking about how you're I don't know, collecting merit or doing meritorious practices in two different camps, the method side of virtue and the wisdom side. And so essentially he's, he says that it doesn't have this sort of connotation, but it does seem from what Geshe Kelsang Wangmo says, and I don't know Tibetan so well, but the more literal translation of this word would be path of accumulation. Bodhisattvas who have entered this path, of course, must accumulate sufficient merit and wisdom to be able to proceed to the next level, the path of preparation. And then they will have to develop merit there to go on to the next path and so on, merit and wisdom. So they will continue, the Bodhisattvas continue to accumulate merit and wisdom on the remaining learner paths. But this is the initial period of accumulation. That's why they give it this name, because the main goal at this point is to accumulate both the meritorious method side through virtuous activities and so on, as well as the wisdom side through acquiring the wisdom of emptiness so that you can then culminate that in being able to cross over to the path of preparation. But you do continue to accumulate merit and wisdom on the remaining learner paths, the path of preparation, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, until you achieve Buddhahood in the path of no more learning. So that's the etymology of the path of accumulation. There are two other names that are sometimes used. And the second one is what we saw in our definition, right? It was called a Mahayana clear realizer of Dharma. The first one, the Mahayana partial concordance with liberation, I have a little explanation for that, and I am indebted to that document. I noticed that Mary posted it, or someone posted, I think it was Mary, in the chat box. Yeah, again, you're welcome to take that and download it and work with it. It might be useful to even have that in front, but I'm going to pull relevant parts of it from that and share them in the slides. So why do we call it a Mahayana partial concordance with liberation? Sounds like a lot of words. What's it really saying? Liberation here, of course, refers to the true cessation that is the elimination of all afflictive obstructions. It's equivalent to attaining the peace of nirvana, liberation being that individual solitary peace that one is able to be free from all of the afflictions and the round of cyclic existence. So liberation is the goal that someone on the Hinayana path would attain as their main goal. Someone on the Bodhisattva path, it's something they pass through. They don't, stop there and want to achieve just that. But okay, so if liberation refers to that, a true cessation that is the elimination of just the intellectually acquired afflictive obstructions, which as you recall from earlier tonight, I said that is removed on when? The path of seeing, right? That is a part or segment of liberation. It is a partial involvement with liberation because it's only the intellectually acquired. Remember that you have to remove the innate afflictive obstructions in order to achieve liberation. So, well, both the intellectually acquired and the innate, but the intellectually acquired are removed first on the path of seeing. The rest of them are on the path of meditation. So thus, to come up with this title, how does this work into Mahayana partial concordance with liberation? The Mahayana path of accumulation is a path that is concordant with or akin to the path that attains only a part or segment of liberation, which is the path of seeing. So it has some concordance with the path of seeing because it is what one develops on the path of accumulation that feeds into the realization that occurs on the path of seeing, which of course is the initial step in removing the afflictive obstructions, but again, only removing a part, a segment, which is the intellectually acquired ones. So just to kind of reiterate that with the chart, I know these are a lot of words I'm throwing out here tonight, and it is late at night. But when we talk about, again, this movement that one goes through when one gets to the path of seeing, it says there, item G is the delineation there. That is the point of direct realization of emptiness and the generation of ultimate bodhicitta. And it is at that point that one actually removes the afflictions, afflictive obstructions that are intellectually acquired. Actually, that's not spelled out on that chart. There's going to be times when I might have to go back to this other chart. If you look at, again, actually it was mentioned, I'm sorry, it was the A, B, and C at the top. So if you look at this point A up at the top there, that is where A, which is the acquired afflictive obstructions, are removed. So what this is saying is that the path of accumulation has a concordance with this sort of partial liberation that occurs when one attains the path of seeing, because it is through the path of accumulation and path of preparation that that is attained. Nonetheless, it's not going to give the same name to the path of preparation. Why? Because it has a slightly different connotation to it. So, okay, so then let's go back to the slides one more time and talk about the second way that we talk about the path of accumulation. It is also called, and this was the definition that we had in our text, a Mahayana clear realizer of Dharma, right? Okay, so Dharma here refers to the 12 branches of the Buddha's teachings, the entire corpus of the Buddha's teachings, again, what is called in Tibetan the Kangyur. This is the scriptural Dharma. This is everything the Buddha taught. Again, I'm not going to go through all 12 branches. These are usually summarized in terms of the 3 baskets, which you may have heard of. The Tripitaka is, I don't know if that's correct pronunciation in Sanskrit. These 3 baskets are the basket of the Vinaya, the teachings on ethics or morality, the Sutra, which are the teachings on concentration mainly, and then the teachings of Abhidharma, which are the teachings on wisdom primarily. Those 3 baskets are a condensation of the 12 branches of the Buddha's teachings, but essentially Dharma is referring to all of what the Buddha taught. So the Mahayana path of accumulation is a Mahayana clear realization, a realization within one's mind. That is a path, a Mahayana path that follows the words of the scriptures. And then in reliance mainly on the first 2 levels of wisdom. Most of you have seen these 3 levels of wisdom before. We talked about them in the Heart Sutra class. You first have a wisdom that arises from listening, which is what you're all engaged in now, right? And what you, anytime you listen to Dharma teachings or read Dharma books, you are involved in a wisdom arising from simply hearing the words, simply hearing the scriptures. And then you begin to develop a deeper understanding through a wisdom that contemplates those, that thinks about those, that reflects on those scriptures. And we're doing this when we studied the Lam Rim, because the Lam Rim contains the essence of the 12 branches of the Buddha's teachings. But these 2 wisdoms advances toward the attainment of the Mahayana clear realizer of the meaning, which, as I mentioned, is how the path of preparation is described. So first we have to get a clear realizer of the Dharma through our listening and our contemplating, and then we will be able to attain a clear realizer of the meaning, which is what is attained when you have a wisdom arisen from meditation, the 3rd level of wisdom that's mentioned at the bottom of the screen there. You cultivate that when you enter into the path of preparation. And we're going to see that coming up, when we get to that. But essentially, this is pointing to the fact that the first 2 levels of wisdom are what we mean by a clear realizer of the Dharma, that we're realizing it in a way of simply hearing and investigating initially the teachings of the Buddha. We haven't yet gained a wisdom that is arising from meditation, which is contingent upon having a union of calm abiding and special insight. Which occurs when we have that observing emptiness at the tail end of the path of accumulation and that causes us to enter into the Mahayana path of preparation, which again is described as a Mahayana clear realizer of the meaning. So once more, to pull up the little chart here for you, what happens again then is that on the path of accumulation, one is achieving this clear realization of the Dharma through studying, hearing the teachings, thinking about them, contemplating them. It's at this point, as it says there, item number 4, when you have a union of calm abiding and special insight observing emptiness, that you then have acquired the wisdom arisen from meditation. And that causes you to move into the path of preparation. So that's why this first path is called the clear realization of Dharma, is because you're working solely with the scriptural Dharma and you're digesting of it, if you will, through taking it in, through hearing it, and then, chewing it over, through your thinking about it and so on. All right. So let's go back for, I think there's one more slide possibly, maybe not. That's just introducing the 3 levels, and that's what we're going to see also in our text. Okay, so there's a small, a middling, and a great level. And I'm going to have more to share on those, but I think I'll probably hold off on that till the next class. Let me see if there are any questions, and then I could maybe do just a little bit more of the text, but I'm fearing that maybe I'm using too many words tonight and everybody's getting kind of overtaken by all the words. Any questions, comments? Anyone? No? Okay. Well, let's go to the text. Was there a question in the chat box at all? No. Okay. Let's go to the text. Oh, you do have a question. Okay.
Divya, do you have a question? Your microphone is unmuted.
No, I think that was by mistake. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Divya.
I'm still digesting the content, so no questions yet.
Okay. All right.
I have one clarifying question.
Sure.
So is the process of realization linear?
Is what was the first part of the question?
I was asking if the process, so my understanding is that there's this process of accumulation, and I'm asking if it's linear.
I mean, as linear as it, I mean, there is a linear component to it in terms of one being able to move through various stages of understanding. If, like one way to express some of this in terms of the accumulation of wisdom in particular that's occurring there is using this schema that's taught in another text that we study in the basic program, which is the study of minds and awarenesses, or mind and cognition. And it's about Buddhist epistemology. How does the mind move? Right now, we are dealing with essentially a wrong consciousness in terms of our understanding of how things exist. We have an ignorance that is grasping at things as inherently existent. And of course, the Bodhisattva, until they get to the path of seeing, they don't begin removing that ignorance in a really fundamental way. But even on the path of accumulation, that's the starting point, is to recognize that they probably haven't, unless they're really sharp facultied Bodhisattva, they haven't really gone through a process of trying to move away from that wrong consciousness. The second step in after that, the first again starting with a wrong awareness, is to develop some doubt about that. And even doubt itself is sometimes divided into three levels. The doubt that still tends towards that wrong awareness, the doubt that is sort of equal with regard to the correct view and the wrong awareness, and then the doubt that starts to move closer to the correct view and further away from the wrong awareness. That's another stage that the Bodhisattva would be engaged in by studying more texts about emptiness, doing more reasoning and what have you. The third, after doubt, so you have a wrong awareness you're starting from, you develop this doubt through its three stages, that leads you to what's called a correct assumption. A correct assumption is where you've gotten to some understanding of emptiness to where you've correctly assumed that things lack inherent existence, but you haven't developed a deeper, incontrovertible awareness around that. Incontrovertible meaning it can't be shaken. So you've got the correct view. It's more of a belief, though, than a kind of like, again, what the Bodhisattva is dealing with here in terms of having a greater belief during this time. But belief, nonetheless, has to be there before one can proceed to that inferential cognition, that inferential awareness that has understood emptiness through reasoning. It's still quite conceptual, but we've gotten it through using the reasonings of dependent arising, the reasonings that we've discussed in previous courses and that are taught in the Lam Rim and so on. When we generate those reasonings, we can actually get to a place where we have an inferential view of or understanding of emptiness, which of course is much different than just having a correct belief. Why? Because it becomes incontrovertible. It becomes unshakable. We can't be moved from that. So the Bodhisattva, in terms of developing their wisdom through the path of accumulation, could go through these different stages, recognizing that they have to identify the ignorance that's the problem to begin with, begin to doubt that ignorance is correct in its thinking and move towards what is more correct, get to a place of some belief in it, some correct assumption about things, but then want to generate some deeper understanding through their reasoning and investigation into emptiness, through their contemplation and so on, that these are correct, that they can't then be shaken from that. Okay, so it's linear in that way, and that one can never sort of make the additional progress without having gone through some sort of mode of moving away from what is an obstacle to proceeding and so on. And then in terms of accumulation of merit, well, that other side of it, the virtuous actions we engage in, that is more, I don't know if linear is quite the right word, but it's cumulative. We keep generating more and more merit that becomes greater and greater, resulting in the state of Buddhahood. And of course, progressing along the path based on levels of accumulation of that. And when you get it to the full point where it's completely full and you have the wisdom side fully manifested, then you are over the line into Buddhahood. So even at the level of the path of accumulation, of course, you're beginning that process. So I don't know if linear is quite the right word for that. But, and then if we talk about other aspects of the path, that like the stages of the path, that's very linear in terms of needing to understand certain things that will then lead one to progress further and further. Nonetheless, I don't want to make it sound too cast in stone, because obviously when we start working with these teachings, we might work with higher teachings that then loosen up some things on the lower teachings. And then, there's an interaction that occurs with something like the Lam Rim. But certainly for the Bodhisattva at this level, because most of the Lam Rim teachings, at least, what will get you to generating bodhicitta, which are the small scope and the middle scope. And then when you enter the great scope, you do that with bodhicitta. Most of that has preceded your entering the path. You've gained some level of realization about all of those topics before you even enter the Mahayana path, because you have to have uncontrived bodhicitta again to get there. So on the path of accumulation, I guess you would be having, again, staying in touch with those teachings, keeping those teachings very vivid in your mind, but you would have already, again, have achieved some understanding of them. And then even in the six perfections, they are set out in a somewhat linear mode, in terms of the easier ones to practice at the beginning, the harder ones later. And one at this level wouldn't be engaging necessarily in a full-fledged perfection of wisdom yet, but would certainly be practicing the other perfections to a large degree. So I don't know if that gives you any, filling out of that. Did you have anything else specific around that
That
question?
was really, really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, all right, Afisha. There's another question here. When do we enter the path of accumulation? When we have an idea of emptiness? I think you just answered. Okay, yes, I did answer that in terms of it's not correlated to emptiness necessarily. There are, again, these sharp facultied bodhisattvas, and maybe some of you are in the Zoom room here. You have a deeper investigation into emptiness before even entering the path. Entering the path of the Mahayana entails having that uncontrived, spontaneous bodhicitta. But they say that many of these sharp facultied bodhisattvas, they investigate emptiness because they want to know that there's a way to achieve Buddhahood before they sign up, in a sense. Because that's a pretty tall order, right? I'm going to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. If you don't have just this pure faith in the Buddha and the Mahayana path that some people may have, you really want to check it up and see, how will I do that? And as I said, this structure of the paths and grounds is one way to gain some confidence in that as well. But the teachings on emptiness are, of course, the main thing, as I said earlier, that is delineating the movement from one level to the next and, proceeding on to Buddhahood. There is a merit component to it, but the main thing that gets you there is removing obscurations, and that requires the wisdom of emptiness. So if you investigate emptiness before entering the path, then you should feel pretty good, because you know that there's a means to do this. It's not just, I'm going to sign up for becoming a Buddha and then have to guess about how I actually accomplish that. You have some confidence that there is a means to do that. Through generating the wisdom, realizing emptiness, you'll be able to remove the afflictive obscurations, you'll be able to remove the knowledge obscurations, and you'll be able to become a Buddha. Okay. All right. I think that may be enough, and we're at our ending time here. So again, if you do have any further questions on this, you're certainly free, as I said, to download that file. If you didn't get a chance to get it from there, we'll make sure it gets out in the Dropbox, but it's also out at Chushita's website. The file itself, I had the whole thing printed out, and it comes to, I don't know how many pages. Is it 70 some? No, it's not that long. Right, yeah, it is. I was in the wrong file here. It's 47 pages, 47, not so long. But again, know that I've covered and kind of jumped over some of the beginning part where she spent a fair amount of time talking about bodhicitta. I didn't do that quite so much last time. So those of you who would like to review the techniques for generating bodhicitta, you might cover those pages. Know that the pages that we're on in terms of that text, that is the material that Venerable Geshe Wangmo put together, is right around page 13, 14, is where I've gone through some of this, even to page 15, and that's where we'll be picking up. And again, I'm kind of combing through that and picking up relevant parts of it. I'm not going to go through that entire document because, again, that covers a lot more things than what maybe I have the time to do. But feel free to review that. Feel free to, again, look through the slides. I'll have those sent along so they get in the Dropbox, the slides from tonight. And then, again, just work with the material as best as you can between classes. And then if any questions come up, be sure to let me know and I'll do my best to address those. Wonderful. Okay, let's go ahead, John, and get the prayers up so we can conclude tonight's class. So again, remembering our motivation of bodhicitta, let's now dedicate with first this prayer that makes sure that all of what we've created in terms of the virtue and so on will bring forth the result that we've been talking about, that final result, the resultant ground of the path of no more learning, our ability to become a Buddha, and in that state to be able to help all others to do that same work. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And we have the second verse, which is all about that mind of bodhicitta that we've also touched on a number of times tonight. Make this strong aspiration that this mind grow, develop in the hearts of ourselves and in the hearts of all sentient beings. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then seeing how we do need our tutors, our guides, our spiritual masters who can help us on our path, we make strong prayers for their good health and long lives, and by extension, not just for these three beings that we're praying for, but all those beings who play that role for ourselves and others. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And for Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally for Lama Yeshe's reincarnation, Tenzin Alsahita, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Then lastly, as usual, let's dedicate for all of those that we're holding in our hearts right now. Every one of us have people, beings in our lives who are experiencing obstacles, who are ill, who are dying, or who have died. Send this positive energy out to those beings so that they receive it. It becomes the cause to remove their suffering immediately and to bring them all the causes that will lead to perfect peace and happiness. And may all beings achieve that through what we've done here tonight. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I hope this class is going okay for you. I realize it is a lot of technology, a lot of technical terms and what have you, but again, just keep trying to relate it back to your own understanding of what is going on behind the scenes. The Lam Rim things like I talked about tonight that precede one entering the path, the practices of the Great Scope that are throughout the entirety of the Mahayana Path, and just keep it grounded in that. But do let me know again if there are any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So, all right. Thank you all so much. Be well. Everyone stay safe, and I'll see you again soon.
Thank you,